Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 29 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
Last episode, the crew continued their visit to Hua Hin, where emotions ran high following the attack on Dr. Sparrman. Orea, the local chief, showed great loyalty by helping the English search for the robbers, even as his people wept in fear for his safety. Though the hunt was unsuccessful, the shared sorrow between the visitors and the islanders revealed the deep humanity of the local culture. Trade resumed, and relations were mended. Shortly after leaving, Orea reappeared in a canoe and announced he had recovered the stolen items and captured the thieves. He invited Cook and Sparrman to witness the punishment, but his message was misunderstood. Believing it concerned another issue, Cook missed the chance to observe the islanders' system of justice. Orea left with a warm farewell. Soon after, Omai joined the ship, beginning his journey to Europe. As they sailed on to Raiatea, the crew encountered new chiefs and were struck by the mix of generosity, rank, and complex political history. During a walk on the island, Georg discovered a haunting burial ground, skulls and bones scattered beneath a decaying corpse left under a simple wooden shelter. The evening ended with the promise of a Hiwa dance, which the visitors had been invited to witness for the very first time.
Saturday, September 11th, 1773, Raiatea.
The performance took place on a level grassy area between two parallel houses. The open space in the middle measured about 23 meters long and 4.5 meters wide. The larger house could hold a considerable number of spectators. The other was a narrow hut raised on posts, closed on all sides except for the front facing the stage. Inside, a partition made of lattice and mats created a changing area for the performers. The floor of this hut was covered with 3 large, finely crafted mats, each decorated with black corner stripes. Along the open front stood 3 wooden drums, covered with sharkskin. The largest was about 90 centimeters high and 30 centimeters wide. 4 or 5 men played them with nothing but their fingers, striking them with incredible speed. After the visitors had spent some time seated across from the stage among the leading women of the island, the dancers finally appeared. One was Porea, Orea's beautiful daughter. The other was a tall, shapely woman, graceful in both face and complexion. Their attire differed noticeably from everyday dress. A piece of brown native cloth, or in some cases blue European fabric, was tightly wrapped around the chest, resembling a fitted gown. Around their hips, 4 layers of local fabric in red and white alternated and were tied with a string. From this waistband hung a long, wide skirt of white material that reached down to their feet. Its length seemed so impractical that the audience worried it might hinder the dancers' movements. Neck, shoulders, and arms were bare. On their heads, they wore an elaborate headdress made of braided human hair called tamau. The braids were stacked in concentric rings to form a turban roughly 20 centimeters high, narrower at the base and hollow inside, filled with fragrant gardenia blossoms. On the front of the turban were 3 to 4 rows of small white flowers, arranged like stars, standing out strikingly against the jet-black hair like pearls. The dancers now began to move to the sound of the drums. They seemed to follow the lead of an elderly man who also danced and spoke a few words that by their tone appeared to be a kind of chant. The women formed various poses and made many intricate movements with their hands. Some gestures might have seemed bold, but they were by no means as indecent as certain scenes in European operas, where even the most modest English ladies are forced to look through their fans.
This remark by Georg Forster during his description of the dance performance on Raiatea reflects both his Enlightenment thinking and a subtle critique of European hypocrisy. As a careful observer of other cultures, Forster often tried to judge local customs on their own terms rather than through the lens of European morality. In this scene, he acknowledges that some of the Tahitian gestures might appear bold or provocative to outsiders, but he immediately puts this into perspective by comparing them to scenes in European operas. By doing so, Forster highlights a double standard. European society tolerated sensuality and eroticism in its own art forms, such as opera and theater, often cloaked in music and allegory, while condemning similar expressions in non-European cultures as immoral or indecent. The image of modest English ladies peeking through their fans serves as an ironic touch. It suggests that these women, despite their outward prudishness, still watch such scenes with curiosity and interest. Forster uses this comparison to defend the dignity and naturalness of Polynesian cultural expressions, showing that what Europeans might find shocking was neither vulgar nor shameful in its original context. This passage exemplifies Forster's broader ethnographic approach, respectful, reflective, and critical of European arrogance.
There was true elegance in the way these women moved their arms, and a remarkable delicacy in the constant play of their fingers. The only gesture that clashed with the visitor's sense of beauty, propriety, and harmony was a disturbing habit. The dancers would contort their mouths in an odd sideways line and twitch their lips in a wave-like spasmodic motion, as if trained by years of practice to produce this strange effect at will. After about 10 minutes of dancing, the two women withdrew into the hut's changing area. In their place, 5 men stepped onto the stage, wrapped in mats, and performed a kind of theatrical piece. It alternated between indecent dances and a dialogue that seemed to follow a fixed syllable pattern. Occasionally, they all shouted out words in unison. Their actions matched the content of the performance. One man knelt while another beat him and pulled his beard. He then played the same tricks on 2 others, one of whom misunderstood and beat him back with a stick. The actors exited the stage, and the drum signaled the second act, performed by 2 more women in a style similar to the first. The men returned for another scene, and finally the women concluded the show with a 4th and final dance. At the end, the dancer sat down, visibly exhausted and sweating. One performer, who was a bit heavier, had a deep blush in her cheeks from exertion, proof of how fine and light her skin must have been. Orea's daughter had performed her role beautifully, especially considering that she had performed twice before, just the day before. The officers from both ships, along with the observers, rewarded the dancers for their skill with glass beads and other decorative gifts. In the afternoon, Uuru, the king of Raiatea, came aboard the ship with Orea and several women to visit Captain Cook. He brought a pig as a gift and received various European goods in return. Among the women in his company was the dancer, whose beautiful complexion had so deeply impressed the visitors. Her name was Taina, or Teinamai, and the simple clothing she now wore suited her far better than the heavy theatrical costume from the performance. Her long, uncut hair was loosely braided with a narrow strip of white cloth and fell in natural curls, more beautiful than any painter's imagination could have created. Her eyes sparkled with fire and expression, shining from a round face softened by a gentle smile. Mr. Hodges tried to sketch her on this occasion, but her liveliness and restlessness made it extremely difficult, almost impossible for him to succeed. This may well explain why the portrait later published in Captain Cook's official account of the voyage, failed to capture her likeness as well as his other works. Though skillfully engraved by Mr. Sherwin, it still fell far short of the delicacy of the original. Even if it lacked true resemblance to the person it was meant to depict, the drawing could still serve as an example of the common facial features of Tahitian and neighboring islanders, and might just as well represent a 10-year-old Tahitian boy. Toward sunset, the high-ranking guests left the ship again, highly pleased with the welcome they had received. A number of women from the common people, however, remained aboard and treated the sailors with the same openness and friendliness as the girls of Tahiti. It was curious that even this class of women possessed a certain degree of vanity. They addressed one another exclusively as Tedua, Madame, a title in this land reserved for noble women and actually meant only for princesses. This custom was already known from Tahiti. For example, whenever the king's sister passed by, the first islander to spot her would loudly call out, "Tedua Haramai, Madame is coming," so that everyone could show proper respect and bare their shoulders. In such cases, they would also sometimes simply say Eri, a word always indicating a person of royal blood. But the sailors, who didn't understand the local language, were firmly convinced that all their sweethearts shared the same name. This often led to amusing scenes. The following 2 days were spent conducting botanical and physical investigations along the coast. Near the northern end of the island, they found numerous deep bays leading into marshy areas where wild ducks and snipes were abundant. However, the game was more skittish than expected. As it later turned out, the islanders valued it as much as the visitors did and hunted it as a delicacy. On Sunday, they were treated to another Hiwa, a dramatic dance performed by the same individuals as before. It followed the same structure as the earlier one, but was shorter in duration. At dawn on the 14th of September, Captain Cook and Captain Furneaux each dispatched a boat to the island of Otaha, located 4 to 6 kilometers, 2 to 3 nautical miles, away, and within the same coral reef as Raiatea. Their hope was to procure a supply of fruits, which were scarce on the island where the ships were currently anchored. To that end, both Lieutenant Pickersgill and Mr. Rowe brought with them a stock of glass beads and nails. Dr. Sparman and Georg's father didn't want to miss the opportunity to explore that island, so they went along as well. During their absence, Orea, the commander of the district where the ship was anchored, invited the visitors to lunch. So the captains of both vessels, along with several officers and passengers, including Georg, went ashore. They were well equipped with pepper, salt, knives, forks, and a few bottles of wine. When they arrived at Orea's house, the floor was mostly covered with leaves that served as a tablecloth. Around this area, the newcomers and the leading men of the island took their seats. They had barely settled when a local man entered, carrying a roasted pig wrapped in banana leaves on his shoulders. He threw it down on the ground before them. Another followed with a smaller pig, and then several others came in with baskets full of breadfruit, bananas, and fermented breadfruit paste, known as mahai. Their host invited them to help themselves. In no time, both pigs were carved. Then a crowd pressed in. Women and common islanders begged in pleading tones for pieces of pork. Each person who received a piece shared it fairly with those nearby. They even passed the meat from hand to hand, all the way to the outer edges of the crowd, where some couldn't get closer because of the crush of people. The men ate their portions with great appetite. The women wrapped theirs in leaves and saved them for later, when they could eat in private. The insistence of the begging and the jealous glances from the chiefs, whenever something was shared with the lower ranks, made it obvious that ordinary people had no entitlement to such delicacies. The pork, as prepared by the islanders, tasted far better to everyone than any European method. It was juicier than boiled meat and more tender than roasted pork. The consistent underground heat preserved all the juices and flavor. The fat had no greasy or unpleasant taste, and the skin, usually tough on European roast pork, was here just as tender as the rest of the meat. At the end of the meal, they opened the wine bottles. Orea enjoyed his glass without even blinking, which surprised the Europeans all the more, as the islanders had otherwise shown a general dislike for strong drinks. Temperance was indeed a common virtue among the people of this archipelago, especially among the lower classes. However, they did have their own intoxicating beverage, highly valued by some of the older chiefs. It was made from the root of a pepper plant called ava, using a method that Georg had witnessed shortly after their arrival. The root was first cut into pieces and then chewed by several individuals. The saliva-soaked mash was spit into a large bowl filled with water or coconut milk. This unappetizing mixture was then strained through coconut fibers, and the chewed clumps were thoroughly pressed to release every drop of liquid into the coconut milk. Finally, the drink was poured into another large bowl and was ready to be served. This foul concoction was consumed with immense eagerness. Some old drinkers prided themselves on being able to empty many bowls. Their passenger Porea, who behaved less reservedly here than on Huahine, once brought one of his new acquaintances into the captain's cabin. The two sat down and began preparing the mixture. Once it was ready, Porea drank nearly a whole cup. Within less than 15 minutes, he was found lying motionless on the floor. His face was bright red, and his eyes looked like they were bulging out of his head. In this state, he slept for several hours, completely unconscious. When he awoke, he was deeply ashamed of his excess. Still, as with any form of excess, overindulgence in this drink did not go unpunished. The elders who were addicted to it were thin and frail, with scaly, shabby skin, red eyes, and red patches all over their bodies. According to their own statements, these were direct consequences of drinking ava. So the pepper root must contain substances that cause such ailments. Nevertheless, the root was also regarded across these islands as a symbol of peace, perhaps because drunkenness fosters a sense of camaraderie.
Awa, also known as kawa in many Pacific cultures, is a traditional drink made from the root of the plant Piper methysticum, a member of the pepper family. Native to the South Pacific, this shrub-like plant has been cultivated for centuries for its medicinal and ceremonial properties. The term awa is used in Tahiti and Hawaii, while kawa is more common in Fiji, Tonga, and other parts of Melanesia. The plant's roots are rich in kavalactones, the compounds responsible for its sedative and muscle-relaxing effects. This passage from Georg Forster's travel account reflects early European observations of the physical consequences of long-term kava consumption. He notes that elders who drank it excessively appeared thin and frail, with scaly skin, bloodshot eyes, and red patches, symptoms that modern medicine identifies as kava dermopathy, a skin condition linked to heavy chronic use. While not life-threatening, this condition is a visible sign of overconsumption. Despite these effects, awa was highly respected and widely used in Polynesian societies. It was regarded as a symbol of peace, often shared during ceremonies, negotiations, and social gatherings. The drink's calming properties helped ease tensions and promote communal bonding, perhaps the reason Forster concludes that drunkenness fosters a sense of camaraderie. Today, kava remains culturally and economically important in the Pacific and is also marketed globally as a natural remedy for anxiety and sleep disorders. However, improper preparation, excessive use, or consumption of non-traditional extracts has raised health concerns, especially regarding liver toxicity. Traditional methods, using peeled roots and cold water infusion, are generally considered safe when consumed in moderation. Thus, Forster's account, while centuries old, touches on issues still relevant today: the balance between cultural practice, health, and responsible use.
As soon as the meal was over, the sailors and servants amused themselves with the remaining scraps, and the islanders, having benefited earlier from the visitors' generosity, now turned their attention to them. But the seamen showed kindness only to the pretty girls, and driven by their crude appetites, demanded some indecency in return for every bite of meat. To crown the day's pleasures, Orea ordered another Hiwa, a ceremonial dance, to be performed. This time, the visitors were allowed into the backstage area to see how the dancers prepared and dressed. That privilege earned the performers several small gifts. For example, the visitors had the idea to decorate their headpieces with strings of glass beads, which the women gladly accepted. Among the spectators were some of the island's most admired beauties. One woman in particular had skin much lighter than what they had seen elsewhere in the islands. Her complexion resembled pale gray wax, though it showed no signs of illness, which might otherwise explain such coloring. Her striking black eyes and hair stood in strong contrast and drew unanimous admiration. They honored her beauty with little presents, but instead of being satisfied, her hunger for ornaments grew stronger. She kept asking each of them, hoping someone still had one last bead in a pocket. One of the men happened to hold a small padlock. As soon as she saw it, she demanded it. The owner refused at first, but because she wouldn't stop begging, he gave in. Carelessly, he hooked the lock through her ear and said that was the place it belonged and where it had to stay. For a while, she felt proud of her new decoration and showed it off. But soon the weight became too heavy and painful. She wanted to get rid of it. The giver, though, had thrown away the key. He told her she had asked for the lock, and if it was now uncomfortable, she had to keep it as punishment for her pushy begging. The girl was crushed. She cried hard and asked each person in turn to help her. Some were willing to help, but none could. There was no fitting key. At last, she turned to the chief. He stepped in with his wife, son, and daughter to support her. They even offered cloth, incense wood, and pigs as ransom. But all efforts failed, until they finally found a matching key. The girl's crying stopped, and her friends regained their peace and joy. Still, the whole incident led to one lasting change. She and the other women on the island gave up begging. After a day filled with generous hospitality from the host and kind behavior from the locals, the group returned to the ship in the evening, pleased. They were even more surprised the next morning. Against the islanders' usual habits, not a single canoe was near the ship. To find out why things had changed so suddenly, the crew rushed to Orea's house. But to their greater astonishment, he and his family had disappeared. Finally, they learned from a few shy locals that Orea had gone to the northern end of the island, afraid they might capture him. Since the visitors couldn't understand this groundless fear, they hurried to calm him and renew their friendship. With that intention, they sailed several kilometers along the coast to the place where Orea had taken refuge. There they found everyone around him in tears. It took many words of reassurance to regain the trust they had once enjoyed. Beads, nails, and hatchets proved to be the most effective means of persuasion. Orea's relatives accused Captain Cook of planning to capture them in order to force the return of the sailors who had fled to Otaha. The visitors quickly realized this was a misunderstanding and assured the islanders that those men hadn't escaped and would certainly return that very day. Yet Orea remained skeptical. He named every important person in both boats and asked individually whether each of them would really return. Only after receiving firm affirmations for each name did he begin to calm down. While they were sitting in a circle with Orea's family, Porea, the Tahitian who had planned to travel to England, hurried over to the captain. He handed over the powder horn he had long been entrusted with and quietly said he would return shortly. But after waiting in vain for a long time, the party finally had to return to the ship without him. They never saw him again. None of the islanders could tell them where he had gone, and to avoid stirring up more suspicion, the captain chose not to investigate too forcefully. After lunch, Georg accompanied the captain on another visit to Orea. During this meeting, a handsome young man approached the naturalist and asked whether he could be taken to England as well. His name was Otaha. He appeared to be around 17 years old, and, judging by his light complexion and clothing, likely came from a prominent family. At first, Georg doubted that someone like Otaha would want to give up the comfortable life of the island's upper class. He explained to the young man with a smile the many hardships he would face if he came along. He would encounter harsh weather and have to make do with unfamiliar, poor food. But none of these arguments swayed him. He remained firm in his decision. Eventually, even many of his friends voiced support for his wish to leave. Georg introduced Ohedidi to Captain Cook, who readily granted the request. The crew returned to the ship, and before sunset, the boats that had been dispatched to Otaha also arrived. These vessels brought back a load of bananas, coconuts, and several pigs purchased on the island. On the same day of their departure, the sailors had reached the eastern side of a beautiful bay called Ohamane early in the morning and dropped anchor. According to their reports, both the landscape and the inhabitants of this island closely resembled those found on the neighboring islands within the same archipelago. In fact, vegetation and wildlife were generally of the same kind across the region, though certain species appeared more frequently on some islands than on others. For example, the tree referred to by the Europeans as the apple tree was plentiful on Tahiti, but relatively rare on Raiatea and Huaheine, and similarly uncommon on Taha. While chickens were nearly absent on Tahiti, they were abundant throughout the Society Islands. Rats, which infested Tahiti by the thousands, appeared in much lower numbers on Otaha, were even less common on Raiatea, and were hardly seen at all on Huaheine. After the crew had eaten lunch in Ohamane Bay, they made their way to the nearest cove to the north to pay a visit to the local chief, Otaha. A Hiwa, or public dance performance, was to be held at his residence. Along the way, the visitors noticed from a distance a woman dressed in a strange outfit and painted entirely black. It was said that she was mourning and currently engaged in funeral rites. The closer the group came to the chief's house, the denser the crowd grew, both because of their arrival and the upcoming dance. When they finally reached the dwelling, the chief, an older man, sat on a wooden chair. As soon as he saw Georg's father approaching, the host made space on the seat and invited him to sit beside him. Before long, 3 young girls opened the performance. The eldest was no older than 10, the youngest not quite 5. As usual, the music consisted of 3 drums. Between the dances, 3 men performed a pantomime play depicting sleeping travelers being robbed of their luggage by thieves, despite the fact that the victims had laid themselves in a circle around their belongings for extra safety. During the show, the crowd was asked to make room for several individuals, approaching the house in pairs. They stopped at the entrance. Among them were both adults and children, their upper bodies bare and oiled with coconut oil. Around their waists they wore sashes of red cloth, and their heads were adorned with tamau, braided strands of hair. The chief introduced them as the O Dawidi, which, judging by his gestures, seemed to mean mourners. As these people neared the house, the area in front of the entrance was covered with cloth, which was soon rolled up again and distributed among the drummers. One of the drummers got into a heated argument with another islander, and before anyone could intervene, they were grappling with each other and pulling hair. To avoid disrupting the celebration, a replacement drummer was quickly put in place, and both quarrelers were chased out of the gathering. Toward the end of the dance, the audience had to clear the space once more as the Odawidi reappeared. Just like before, they remained at the entrance of the house without performing any particular ceremony. In front of the chief's house, many canoes had been pulled ashore. In one of them, which had a roof, lay the body of the deceased man for whom the mourning ceremony had been held. Because of this, the travelers had to anchor their boats a little farther away. Luckily, there was a house nearby where they found shelter from the rainy and stormy night. The next morning, Otaha paid them a return visit. He offered to accompany them wherever they went. So they took him into the boat and sailed around the northern end of the island. Inside the reef lay many long, flat islands covered with palm trees and other vegetation. In this area, they bought a good stock of bananas. Further south, they stopped at the house of the highest chief, Boba, who had been appointed governor of the island by the king of Bora Bora, Opuni. However, they didn't meet Boba in person, as he was away at the time. After lunch, they discovered that the rest of their trade goods had been stolen during the meal. The missing bag had held nails, mirrors, and glass beads. In this difficult situation, the officers decided it was safest to seize some livestock and valuables from the islanders and keep them until the stolen items were returned. They started this forced measure right on the marketplace. There they took a pig, some mother-of-pearl shells, and several bundles of cloth. The locals only allowed it under serious threat of firearms. The group split up. Some guarded the boats, others watched over the confiscated goods, while the rest, led by the lieutenant, continued the operation. The old chief Otaha went with them, but he didn't feel any more comfortable than the dogs in the fable. Wherever they went, the villagers fled and drove their animals into the hills. To see how the firearms would affect them, the officer ordered 3 muskets to be fired into the air. The loud shots frightened one of the fugitives, a nobleman with massively swollen legs from elephantiasis, into returning. He handed over his pigs and several bundles of cloth. Then the group took 2 breastplates and a drum from Boba's house. They brought their spoils back to the building they had chosen as their meeting point. Toward evening, Otaha left them but returned shortly after with the stolen bag. About half the nails, glass beads, and similar items were still inside. He stayed with them for the night.
That wraps up episode 29 of Georg Forster's journey around the world with Captain Cook about the HMS Resolution. A detailed map of all places mentioned in this episode is linked in the show notes. For a glimpse of how these historic sites appear today, check out my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I follow Forster's route and reveal traces of history in the modern world. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next leg of the expedition. There's still much more to explore. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.